What if the love of your life was someone you promised to marry, in kindergarten? Years later, they meet again, but this time, the stakes are higher, the secrets darker, and the promise? It's far from forgotten. The sun hung low over the small town of Willow Creek, casting golden light across the playground of Meadowridge Elementary. Children's laughter echoed in the air as they raced around the monkey bars and swings. Near the edge of the playground, beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak tree, 2 5-year-olds sat in the shade, their voices blending with the rustling leaves. Finn McAllister, with a mop of unruly dark hair and a mischievous grin, was digging a small hole in the dirt with a stick. Next to him sat Elodie Rain, her blonde curls bouncing as she carefully placed tiny daisies into a makeshift crown. They were inseparable, the kind of friendship that only young children could create, simple, pure, and unshakable. "I'm going to marry you one day," Finn declared suddenly, looking up from his digging. His tone was casual, as if he'd just decided on something as ordinary as what they'd play next. Elodie's blue eyes widened, her tiny hands pausing mid-braid on the daisy chain. "You are?" she asked, tilting her head in curiosity. "Yep," Finn replied confidently, thrusting the stick into the ground like a flag of determination. "When we grow up, I'm gonna marry you, and we'll live in a house with a big tree like this one. And you can make as many daisy crowns as you want." Elodie giggled, the sound bright and carefree. "But what if I don't want to marry you?" Finn furrowed his brow, considering this as though it were the most serious problem he'd ever encountered. "You will," he said at last, his grin returning. "Because we're best friends. And best friends stick together forever." The simplicity of his logic made sense to her young mind, and she nodded solemnly. "Okay, but only if you promise to let me have a dog too." Finn's face lit up. "Deal. We'll have the biggest dog ever." They shook on it, their tiny hands clasping in a serious but awkward handshake, sealing a promise neither of them truly understood. In their innocent world, the future was a distant dream, and that moment beneath the oak tree was all that mattered. But life had other plans. That evening, Elodie's parents sat her down and broke the news: they were moving. Her father had found a new job in another state, far from Willow Creek. She didn't understand why they had to leave, only that everything familiar, including Finn, would soon be gone. The next day, Elodie told Finn, tears streaming down her cheeks. He didn't cry, but his usual smile faded. "You can't go," he said, his voice trembling. "We're supposed to stick together forever." "I don't want to go," Elodie sobbed. "But my mommy and daddy said we have to." Finn stood silently for a moment, his fists clenched. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, chipped marble, a treasure from his collection. "Here," he said, placing it in her hand. "So you don't forget me." Elodie clutched the marble tightly, her tears falling onto its smooth surface. "I won't forget," she promised. "And you won't forget me either, right?" "Never," Finn said firmly. "I'll find you again. I promise." The next day, Elodie's family packed their car and drove away, leaving Willow Creek and Finn behind. He stood at the edge of the playground, watching the car disappear down the road. For a long time, he stared at the horizon, holding on to the memory of her smile and their promise beneath the oak tree. As the years passed, the old oak remained, but the voices of 2 children faded into history, carried away by the relentless march of time. The promise they made, however, lingered like the faint scent of wildflowers after a storm, waiting for the day it might be fulfilled. The years rolled by, reshaping lives in ways neither Finn nor Elodie could have imagined. Time had a way of sanding down the sharp edges of childhood memories, but some things refused to be erased entirely. For Finn McAllister, Elodie's absence left a hollow space he didn't quite understand at first, though he learned to bury it beneath the chaos of growing up. Finn's family life fractured not long after Elodie moved away. His parents' marriage had always been tenuous, their arguments often reverberating through the walls of their modest home. When the divorce finally came, it was less a shock and more an inevitability. Finn's mother took custody, but she struggled to navigate her new reality. Depression settled over her like a heavy fog, and Finn, still just a boy, was left to fend for himself more often than not. He became resourceful, toughened by necessity. After school, he found small ways to keep himself occupied, fixing bikes for neighborhood kids, delivering newspapers, and spending long hours exploring the woods behind his house. It was during these solitary moments that his thoughts would drift to Elodie. He wondered if she still had the marble he'd given her, if she ever thought about him. As he grew older, those questions felt more distant, like echoes from a past he couldn't quite reach. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Elodie was learning to survive in her own way. Her family's new start in a different state was anything but idyllic. Her father's drinking, which had been manageable before the move, spiraled out of control. Her mother worked tirelessly to keep food on the table, often pulling double shifts at the diner. This left Elodie to navigate her father's unpredictable moods alone. To escape, she turned to music. An old, battered violin her mother had picked up at a thrift store became her sanctuary. Elodie wasn't formally trained, but she poured herself into the instrument, teaching herself to play through trial and error. The mournful sound of the strings became her voice when words failed her. By the time she reached middle school, her talent was undeniable. It caught the attention of a music teacher who saw her potential and took her under his wing, offering lessons after school. Music gave her a sense of purpose, but it didn't erase the pain of her father's neglect or the loneliness she carried. Late at night, when the house was silent, she would sometimes pull out the chipped marble Finn had given her. It rested in a small wooden box under her bed, a tangible link to a happier time. She would turn it over in her fingers, the cool surface soothing her as she whispered to herself, "I wonder if he kept his promise." Finn, now a teenager, channeled his restless energy into sports. Football became an outlet for his frustration, a place where he could release the anger and sadness that had built up over the years. His teammates respected him for his grit, but few knew the weight he carried off the field. Despite his popularity, he kept people at arm's length, wary of forming attachments he feared might break. By the time he graduated high school, Finn had grown into a strong, dependable young man. He chose to stay in Willow Creek, finding work as a firefighter. The job suited him, physically demanding, fast-paced, and meaningful. But there were moments, in the quiet aftermath of a rescue or during the long hours waiting for a call, when his mind would drift back to Elodie. He would wonder where she was, what she was doing, and if she ever thought about him. For Elodie, music became her ticket out of her difficult home life. A scholarship to a prestigious music school in New York offered her a chance to reinvent herself. She poured every ounce of herself into her craft, determined to make the most of the opportunity. By her early 20s, she was performing in small venues, her soulful violin pieces earning her recognition in the city's competitive music scene. Yet, even as she stood on brightly lit stages, a part of her remained tethered to the past. The marble still traveled with her, tucked safely into her violin case. Sometimes, she would close her eyes and imagine the boy who had given it to her, his promise echoing faintly in her heart. Life continued, pulling them further apart, yet inexplicably bound by the memory of that sunny afternoon beneath the oak tree. Both had endured hardships, learned resilience, and forged their own paths. But neither could have predicted how those paths would one day cross again. The city of New York, with its towering skyscrapers and ceaseless hum of life, had become Elodie's new home. She'd carved out a modest yet promising career as a violinist, performing at intimate venues and collaborating with other musicians. Each performance was an act of vulnerability, pouring her emotions into the strings of her violin. Critics praised her ability to connect with the audience, calling her music raw and soul-stirring. But they didn't know the source of her pain, the years of loneliness and quiet determination that had shaped her. Despite her successes, a lingering restlessness remained. Elodie had reached a plateau in her career and struggled to compose something new. Her mentor suggested a change of scenery might help her reconnect with her muse. On an impulse, she decided to visit her hometown, Willow Creek, a place she hadn't seen since she was a little girl. The decision was both terrifying and exhilarating. Memories of her childhood, both sweet and bitter, flooded back as she booked her ticket. She packed her violin and the marble Finn had given her, wondering what it would feel like to walk the streets of her past. Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, Finn was living a very different life. The town was still small, still quiet, and still home. After high school, he had joined the local fire department, following a pull he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the need to prove himself, to be useful, or to create meaning out of the chaos he had grown up in. Whatever the reason, the job suited him. Finn had become a cornerstone of the community, known for his steady demeanor and unflinching courage. He was the guy people turned to in emergencies, the one who would run into a burning building without hesitation. Yet, behind his stoic exterior, he carried a quiet ache. Life felt routine, predictable. His childhood promise to Elodie had become a faint echo, something he rarely thought about anymore, except on those rare nights when the silence in his small apartment felt too loud. One crisp autumn morning, Finn was sitting in a corner booth at Maples Cafe, the local coffee shop he frequented after shifts. He nursed a cup of black coffee, reading through the morning news on his phone. Outside, the leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, falling gently onto the sidewalks of Willow Creek. Elodie stepped off the bus at the town's main street, her violin case slung over her shoulder. She glanced around, taking in the familiar sights that seemed smaller than she remembered. The diner where her family used to eat Sunday breakfast still stood, its neon sign flickering slightly. The bookstore with the faded awning still displayed paperbacks in the window. Everything felt both unchanged and distant, like stepping into a forgotten dream. She walked into Maples Cafe, the bell above the door jingling as she entered. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries enveloped her. It felt comforting, almost like stepping into the arms of an old friend. She ordered a tea and glanced around for a seat. That's when she saw him. Finn sat in a corner, his head slightly bowed as he scrolled through his phone. He looked older, of course, his shoulders broader, his features sharper. But there was no mistaking the familiar line of his jaw or the way his dark hair still fell messily over his forehead. Her heart skipped a beat, a strange mix of disbelief and nervous excitement washing over her. Finn, unaware of her presence, reached for his coffee cup. As he raised it to his lips, his gaze lifted, and locked onto hers. Time seemed to freeze. Finn's mind raced as he stared at the woman standing near the counter. She was older now, her face more defined, but her blue eyes were unmistakable. For a moment, he wondered if he was imagining things, if his tired mind was playing tricks on him. But when she smiled, a hesitant, uncertain curve of her lips, he knew. "Elodie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her fingers clutching the strap of her violin case. "Hi, Finn." Neither of them moved at first, as if afraid that breaking the moment would shatter the delicate thread reconnecting them. Then Finn stood, his chair scraping slightly against the floor, and walked toward her. "You're back," he said, his words almost a question. "Just visiting," Elodie replied, her voice soft but steady. "It's been a long time." "Yeah," Finn agreed, his heart pounding in his chest. "It has." They stood there, two people tethered by the faint remnants of a childhood promise, unsure of what to say or do next. The cafe buzzed around them, but in that moment, it felt as though they were the only two people in the room. Finn gestured to his table, and Elodie followed him, her tea trembling slightly in her hands. The cafe was warm and inviting, yet the air between them carried an unspoken tension. Finn pulled out a chair for her before sitting down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elodie traced the rim of her cup, and Finn stared at her as though trying to confirm she was real. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," Finn said finally, his voice low and filled with wonder. Elodie looked up, her eyes meeting his. "I didn't think I'd come back," she admitted. But I guess I needed to. Finn leaned back in his chair, studying her. It's been, what, 15 years, he asked, his tone half incredulous, half nostalgic. 16, Elodie corrected softly. A long time. Her words hung in the air like a bridge between their past and present. Finn smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting as he remembered the little girl who used to sit under the oak tree with him. You look different, he said, then quickly added, but the same too. If that makes sense. Elodie laughed, a quiet, musical sound that tugged at something deep inside him. You're not exactly the 5-year-old I remember either, she replied. But you still have that same look. What look? Finn asked, raising an eyebrow. Like you're about to do something bold, she said with a grin. Even when you're just sitting there. Finn chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Guess I haven't changed much. They fell into a rhythm, their initial awkwardness giving way to the natural connection they had once shared. Finn asked about her life, and Elodie shared bits and pieces, her move to New York, her music, the struggles of finding her footing in such a competitive field. She spoke carefully, leaving out the darker parts of her story, though Finn could sense there was more beneath the surface. What about you? Elodie asked, genuinely curious. What's life like for Finn McAllister these days? Finn shrugged, his expression turning thoughtful. I stayed here. Joined the fire department after high school. It felt right, I guess. Like I could make a difference. Saving lives, Elodie said, her admiration evident. That sounds like you. Finn's ears reddened slightly, and he looked down at his coffee. It's not always as heroic as it sounds, but yeah. It's good work. Elodie smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. He was still the same Finn, humble, kind, and quietly steadfast. Their conversation stretched on, weaving between shared memories and updates about their lives. Finn told her about Willow Creek, how it had changed and yet stayed the same. Elodie listened intently, her gaze flicking to his hands as he spoke. They were calloused, strong, and a reminder of the years that had passed since they last held her small hand under the oak tree. Eventually, the weight of the moment grew heavier. There was so much left unsaid, but neither knew how to broach it. Finn finally broke the silence, his voice hesitant. I never forgot you, he admitted, his eyes fixed on hers. Not really. I mean, life happened, but you were always there, somewhere in the back of my mind. Elodie swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her cup. I didn't forget either, she said softly. I couldn't. Finn's expression softened, a mixture of relief and something deeper. I always wondered what happened to you, he said. If you were okay. Elodie hesitated, the temptation to spill everything, her father's drinking, the nights she spent hiding in her room, the weight of carrying her family's burdens, bubbling up inside her. But instead, she simply said, it wasn't always easy. But I found a way. Finn nodded, sensing her reluctance. He didn't push, though his curiosity lingered. You've done well, he said instead. Coming back here. I'm glad you did. Elodie's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Me too, she whispered. Their conversation was interrupted by the cafe's door swinging open, letting in a gust of cold wind. Elodie glanced at the time on her phone and realized how late it had gotten. I should probably go, she said reluctantly, standing up. Finn rose as well, his tall frame towering slightly over hers. Do you have a place to stay? He asked, concern flickering in his eyes. I'm staying at a small inn just outside town, Elodie replied. But maybe we could catch up again. While I'm here. Finn's smile returned, slow and genuine. I'd like that. They exchanged numbers, and Elodie left the cafe, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked down the familiar streets, memories rushing back with every step, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was exactly where she needed to be. Finn stood by the window, watching her go, a quiet determination settling over him. 16 years had passed, but something told him their story wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Elodie spent the next few days reacquainting herself with Willow Creek. The town was smaller than she remembered, but its charm remained intact. She walked the streets where she had once played as a child, pausing to admire the changes time had brought. The old oak tree in the schoolyard still stood, its branches reaching skyward like a silent witness to her past. Despite the nostalgia, her return wasn't without complications. One afternoon, while walking back to her inn, she heard a familiar voice call her name. She froze, the sound sending a chill through her spine. Turning slowly, she saw him, her father. He stood on the corner of Main Street, his frame thinner and his face more weathered than she remembered. His clothes were rumpled, and his eyes carried the telltale signs of years of alcohol abuse. Elodie's heart sank as he stumbled toward her. "Elodie," he slurred, his voice thick. "I heard you were back. Didn't think you'd bother to see your old man." She hesitated, torn between pity and anger. "I didn't think you'd care," she said carefully, her tone colder than she intended. Her father frowned, the lines on his face deepening. "Still got that sharp tongue, huh? Just like your mother. She always thought she was better than me too." Elodie clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. "I don't want to fight, Dad." "Fight?" He laughed bitterly. "You're too good for this place now, aren't you? Big shot violinist, coming back just to look down on us." "That's not why I'm here," Elodie said firmly. "I came back because I needed to reconnect with where I came from." Her father scoffed, his expression hardening. "Reconnecting, huh? Well, don't expect me to roll out the red carpet." Without another word, he turned and shuffled down the street, muttering under his breath. Elodie watched him go, a mixture of guilt and sadness swirling in her chest. She had always hoped that time might soften him, but it seemed the years had only deepened his bitterness. That evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Elodie found herself dialing Finn's number. She hadn't intended to reach out so soon, but the encounter with her father had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Finn answered on the second ring. "Elodie." His voice was warm, instantly grounding her. "Hi," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I needed someone to talk to." "I'm glad you called," Finn said without hesitation. "Where are you?" "At the inn," she replied. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said, and before she could protest, he hung up. True to his word, Finn arrived quickly, his truck rumbling to a stop outside the inn. Elodie met him on the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. Finn stepped out, his presence steady and reassuring. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face. Elodie nodded, though she wasn't entirely convincing. "I ran into my dad," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Finn's jaw tightened. "How bad was it?" "He was drunk," she said simply. "And angry. Same as always." Finn sighed, his expression softening as he stepped closer. "I'm sorry, Elodie. You don't deserve that." She blinked back tears, grateful for his kindness. "It's just hard, you know. Coming back here. I thought maybe things would be different." "They can be," Finn said gently. "You're not the same person you were when you left. You've grown, and you've done amazing things. Don't let him take that away from you." His words settled over her like a balm, soothing the ache in her chest. She nodded, managing a small smile. "Thanks, Finn. You always know what to say." "I try," he said, his grin lopsided but genuine. "Come on, let's get out of here for a bit. I know a place that'll clear your head." They drove to the edge of town, where a small lake sparkled under the fading sunlight. Finn parked the truck, and they walked to the water's edge, the quiet hum of nature surrounding them. Elodie took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "It's my favorite spot," Finn admitted. "Whenever life gets too loud, I come here." They sat on a fallen log by the shore, the silence between them comfortable. For the first time since her arrival, Elodie felt a sense of peace. Finn didn't press her to talk, didn't demand explanations. He simply sat with her, his presence enough. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Elodie glanced at him. "Thank you, Finn. For being here." He looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "Always." In that moment, Elodie realized just how much she had missed having someone she could trust, someone who didn't expect anything in return. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't facing the world alone. The days following their evening at the lake brought a strange sense of normalcy for Elodie. She spent her mornings walking the streets of Willow Creek, her afternoons revisiting old haunts, and her evenings practicing her violin in the quiet of her in-room. Despite her efforts to focus on her music, her thoughts often drifted to Finn. Their conversations had become a regular part of her routine. Sometimes they spoke over the phone, and other times Finn would show up unexpectedly, inviting her to join him on a walk or for a cup of coffee at Maple's Cafe. Slowly, the barriers that time and distance had built between them began to crumble. But the cracks in Elodie's life deepened one fateful afternoon. She was leaving the local library, a few books tucked under her arm, when she heard raised voices near the corner of the street. Her heart sank when she saw her father arguing with the owner of a nearby convenience store. His face was red, his gestures wild and erratic. "Sir, you need to leave," the owner said firmly, stepping out from behind the counter. "You think you're better than me?" her father spat, swaying slightly. "You've always thought you were better." Elodie's stomach twisted. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Dad," she called, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Let's go." Her father turned, his bleary eyes narrowing as he recognized her. "Oh, look who it is," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The prodigal daughter. Come to save the day." "Please," Elodie said quietly, stepping closer. "This isn't the place. Let's go home." "Home?" he scoffed. "You don't know anything about home. You left. You left us." The words hit her like a slap, but she held her ground. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to." "Convenient," he snarled, his voice rising. "You think you're too good for this town. Too good for me." The store owner stepped closer, his expression warning. "I'll call the sheriff if you don't leave now." Elodie's father muttered under his breath, casting a final glare at the store owner before staggering away. Elodie stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her chest. She barely registered the store owner's concerned look as she turned and walked in the opposite direction. Her feet carried her automatically, and before she knew it, she was standing outside the fire station. Finn's truck was parked out front, and she hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The familiar scent of smoke and leather filled the air, and she found Finn in the lounge, leaning over a table with a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up as she entered, immediately noticing the tension in her posture. "Elodie," he said, setting his cup down. "What happened?" Her voice broke as she told him about the scene with her father. Finn listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. When she finished, she sank into the chair across from him, her hands trembling. "I just don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could handle seeing him, but he's so angry. And he blames me for everything." Finn reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "It's not your fault," he said firmly. "You've done nothing wrong." "It feels like it is," Elodie said, her voice cracking. "I left, Finn. I left my mom to deal with him on her own. I ran away. You didn't run, Finn said gently. You survived. You had to. And you've made something incredible out of your life. Elodie met his eyes, the warmth and certainty in his gaze wrapping around her like a lifeline. It's just so hard, she whispered. I want to help him, but I don't know how. You can't fix him, Finn said softly. Not unless he wants to change. And it doesn't sound like he's ready for that. Tears welled in Elodie's eyes, and she nodded, grateful for his understanding. Thank you, she said, her voice shaky. I don't know what I'd do without you. Finn smiled faintly, squeezing her hand before letting go. You're stronger than you think, Elodie. But you don't have to face this alone. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the station and the faint crackle of the radio filling the space around them. For the first time in years, Elodie allowed herself to lean on someone else. And for the first time, she felt like she didn't have to carry the weight of her past on her own. When she left the station, the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, and the air was cool against her skin. Finn walked her to her car, his presence solid and reassuring. As she drove back to the inn, she realized something had shifted. Finn was no longer just a memory from her past, he was becoming an anchor in her present. For the first time, the idea of staying in Willow Creek didn't feel so impossible. Maybe, just maybe, she was finding a way to move forward. The days in Willow Creek passed more quickly than Elodie anticipated. Each one brought her closer to the life she had left behind and to Finn, who seemed to effortlessly fill the empty spaces she had carried for so long. His steady presence grounded her, offering a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in years. But even as the threads of her past began to intertwine with her present, the weight of her father's anger lingered in the background, casting a shadow over her newfound peace. One crisp morning, Elodie decided to revisit the old elementary school. She had avoided it until then, afraid of what emotions it might stir, but something compelled her to go. The air was cool and fresh, the sky a brilliant blue as she walked the familiar path leading to the playground. Her footsteps slowed as the old oak tree came into view. It stood as tall and proud as ever, its branches spreading wide like welcoming arms. The sight of it brought a flood of memories rushing back, Finn's mischievous grin, the feel of the dirt beneath her hands as she wove daisy chains, and his bold promise to marry her one day. She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing against the bark as she stood beneath its canopy. She didn't hear Finn approach until he spoke. Still standing after all these years. Startled, she turned to see him walking toward her, his hands in his jacket pockets. He gave her a warm smile, his dark eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. Finn, she said, her voice soft. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, he replied, stopping a few feet away. I saw your car parked out front. Thought I'd check in. Elodie gestured toward the tree. I wanted to see if it was still here. It feels strange, being back. Finn nodded, his gaze drifting up to the branches. This place holds a lot of memories. She smiled, a tinge of sadness in her expression. It does. It feels like a lifetime ago. They stood in silence for a moment, the crisp breeze rustling the leaves above them. Finn turned to her, his expression thoughtful. You've been through a lot since then. So have you, she countered, her eyes meeting his. But you stayed here, Finn. You stayed and built a life. Finn shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. Doesn't mean it's been easy. Sometimes I wondered what it would have been like to leave, to start over somewhere new. But I guess, this place is home. Elodie's smile faltered as she looked down, her fingers brushing the chipped marble in her pocket. I don't know if it's home for me anymore. So much has changed. Maybe, Finn said gently. But some things don't change. Like this tree. And maybe, some promises. Elodie looked up sharply, her heart skipping a beat. You remember that? Of course I do, Finn said with a soft laugh. How could I forget? I promised to marry you under this tree, didn't I? She laughed too, the sound light and genuine. We were kids, Finn. You didn't even know what marriage meant. Maybe not, he admitted, his smile fading as his expression grew serious. But I knew I cared about you. And I still do. Elodie's breath caught in her throat. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and it sent a wave of warmth through her. She looked away, her cheeks flushing. Finn. I don't know if I can stay here. There's so much history, so much pain. I know, he said, stepping closer. And I'm not saying it'll be easy. But you don't have to face it alone. Whatever you decide, I'm here. I'll always be here. Her eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them away, refusing to let herself break. You've already done so much for me. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Finn said firmly. You never were. You've been carrying so much on your own for so long. Let someone else help you for once. Elodie looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the depth of his care and the steadiness of his resolve. She realized that he wasn't offering her pity or charity, he was offering her a partnership, a way forward that didn't have to be so lonely. She nodded slowly, her voice trembling. I'll try, Finn. I'll try to stay. A smile spread across his face, one so full of relief and quiet joy that it made her heart ache. That's all I could ever ask. They stood together under the old oak tree, the past and present converging around them. For the first time in a long while, Elodie felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe she could find a way to heal, and that Finn might be part of that journey. In the weeks that followed, Elodie began to settle into the rhythm of life in Willow Creek. It wasn't an easy transition. Each day felt like walking a tightrope between her past and the future she was trying to build. But she wasn't walking it alone anymore. Finn was always there, a steadying presence that reminded her she didn't have to bear her burdens by herself. Their connection deepened with each passing day. Finn made her laugh in ways she hadn't in years, and his unwavering belief in her slowly chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. For Finn, having Elodie back felt like a missing piece of his life had finally fallen into place. Her determination, her resilience, and the quiet vulnerability she allowed him to see only made him care for her more. But the challenges weren't over. One cold evening, Elodie received a call from her mother. The trembling in her mother's voice was enough to make her grip the phone tighter. It's your father, her mother said. He's in the hospital. Elodie's stomach dropped. What happened? He fell, her mother explained, her voice thick with emotion. The doctor said it's from years of drinking. His liver is failing, Elodie. He doesn't have much time. Elodie sat in stunned silence, the weight of the words pressing down on her. She had spent so many years resenting her father for his neglect, for his anger, for the pain he had caused her and her mother. And yet, hearing that his life was nearing its end stirred a confusing mixture of emotions, grief, guilt, and a faint, aching love that refused to be extinguished. The next morning, she told Finn about the call. He listened quietly, his expression soft with understanding. Do you want me to go with you? He asked. Elodie hesitated before nodding. I think I do. They went to the hospital together. Finn stayed in the waiting room while Elodie stepped into her father's room. The sight of him took her breath away. He looked so small, so frail, lying in the hospital bed. His once fiery eyes were dull, his skin pale and stretched thin over his bones. Dad, she said quietly, her voice trembling. His eyes fluttered open, and he turned his head toward her. For a moment, he looked confused, but then recognition dawned. Elodie, he croaked. You came. Tears welled in her eyes. Of course I came. He stared at her, his expression wavering between regret and relief. I was a terrible father, he admitted, his voice weak but resolute. I know that. I'm sorry, Elodie. I'm so sorry. The rawness of his apology broke something inside her. She had waited so long to hear those words, and now that they were here, they felt bittersweet. She stepped closer, taking his hand in hers. I forgive you, Dad, she whispered. I forgive you. The hours that followed were quiet, filled with fragmented conversations and long silences. When the time came to say goodbye, Elodie kissed his forehead, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. As she left the room, Finn was there, standing just outside the door. She walked into his arms without hesitation, letting him hold her as the weight of the moment crashed over her. In the days after her father's passing, Elodie felt a strange sense of clarity. The grief was heavy, but so was the relief of having let go of years of anger. Finn stayed by her side, offering quiet support and moments of lightness when she needed them most. One sunny afternoon, not long after, Finn surprised her by taking her back to the oak tree. He had packed a picnic and insisted on making a day of it. As they sat beneath the branches, eating sandwiches and sharing stories, Elodie felt a warmth she hadn't known in years, a sense of home. Finn cleared his throat, drawing her attention. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, he said, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. What is it? She asked, tilting her head curiously. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Elodie's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Elodie, he began, his dark eyes locking onto hers. We've both been through a lot. And I know neither of us imagined life would bring us back here, to this tree, to each other. But I can't imagine my life without you anymore. You're everything I didn't know I needed. And I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, if you'll let me. Will you marry me? Tears blurred her vision as she looked at him, the boy she had once known, now a man offering her his heart. She smiled, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, Finn. Of course, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand steady despite the emotion on his face. They kissed beneath the oak tree, their shared promise from so many years ago finally fulfilled. Their wedding was small but beautiful, held in Willow Creek with the people who mattered most. As Elodie walked down the aisle, her violin resting safely in its case nearby, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Her past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. And her future, with Finn by her side, was brighter than she ever could have imagined. The ending of this story resonates as a poignant reminder that life is a mosaic of broken pieces, but love and forgiveness can fill the gaps to create something whole and beautiful. Finn and Elodie's journey is not just about finding each other again, it's about confronting the pain of their pasts, healing old wounds, and discovering that they are stronger together than apart. What makes this ending truly impactful is its balance of realism and hope. It doesn't promise a perfect, fairy tale future but instead offers a grounded vision of two people choosing to build a life together despite their scars. Their love is not born out of convenience but out of a shared understanding of resilience, vulnerability, and the courage it takes to let someone in. For me, this story speaks to the idea that the people who are meant to stay in our lives will find their way back to us, even after years of separation. It's a story about promises, not just the ones made in childhood, but the promises we make to ourselves to seek happiness, to forgive, and to move forward. The ending feels earned, heartfelt, and leaves you with the sense that no matter how heavy the past, the future can always be lighter with love by your side.